Okay, here's one for you. I am a big believer in getting to know yourself and learning about yourself and understanding your own psychology and essentially what kind of makes you tick and all that jazz. And if for no other reason, you can't really hope to understand other people until you can understand yourself. Understanding yourself gives you something to compare other people to, because, and I would imagine this is somewhat of a problem with AI or robotics in general, because when you build an AI system and you want it to try and interpret the world, it has nothing to compare it to. So if you just think of one of the main personality traits, say extroversion, I will rate how extroverted a person is in relation to how extroverted I am. Because like most things, it's relevant. Like most things, it's relative. So if you want to go out and meet people all the time more than me, you're a fucking extrovert. Because I'm not massively introverted, but I certainly have a leaning towards introversion. I reckon if the introversion extroversion spectrum was split in half, I'd be left of center favoring introversion. And knowing where I am on that spectrum, knowing that I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert, for argument's sake, that's how I interpret how extroverted somebody is. Essentially, if they're more or less extroverted than me. And even if I was an extremely extroverted person, I think I'd do it the same way. Because if I'm extremely extroverted, granted, nobody's going to be way more extroverted than me, because you can only be so extroverted. But so if somebody's essentially the same as me, they're on the upper end of the extroversion spectrum and they're very extroverted. And they'd have to be completely not like you at all to be introverted. So that's how we typically kind of judge people. It's in relationship to ourselves. And we have a relative understanding of ourselves, whether we're aware of it or not. So regardless of what height you are, you judge a person on whether or not you judge another person on how tall they are in accordance to your own height. So if you're 6'4" and somebody's taller than you can safely say, holy shit, that cunt's tall. But if they're, a little bit shorter than you, they're, tallish, shorter again, kind of average. Do you know that kind of way? Like we use ourselves as a measuring stick. And not just for height, but for how extroverted we are, or how narcissistic we are, how selfish we are, or whatever else. Now, that can get a bit dodgy. And maybe that's why people don't understand other people very well. Because I know people, call him Brian. I know Brian. And Brian didn't think that thing he overheard was particularly harsh. He heard some fella tell his missus she was nothing but a cunt, and he regretted ever meeting her in the first place. And my friend Brian overheard this and went, sounds about right, sounds about fair. And everybody else goes, come on now, Brian, that is harsh, like that's objectively harsh. But to Brian thinks it's kind of normal, because that's the type of thing that Brian would say. So it's not perfect, the whole having yourself as a reference point, because if you're a bit of an extremist, like the height thing is a bit weird because you can see people's height. I was going to say if you're 6'5", and you judge everybody else, that's a good example actually. If you're 6'5" and you judge anybody who's a good bit shorter than you as short, well, you've got a bad barometer. It's a bad gauge. You have a bad reference point. You need to know what's kind of average. But height is an easy one, because you can look at a group of, when you walk into a room, if you're 6'5", if you walk into a shopping centre or a crowded stadium or theatre or whatever it is, any scenario whereby there's hundreds if not thousands of people around you, you're going to be one of the tallest people there if you're 6'5". So it's easy to know that you're on an extreme end of a spectrum. But with extroversion, for example, it's not like that. or conscientiousness or any of the other big 5 personality traits. We don't wear our conscientiousness. I was going to say we don't wear our conscientiousness on our sleeves, but we kind of do. Like if you work with somebody, if you work side by side with somebody, you're going to know how conscientious they are. Because if you would describe them as a lazy bastard, they're not going to be particularly conscientious. And if you would describe them as a fucking real grafter, then they are. But again, like height, you can actually see conscientiousness in people. And extroversion, I suppose, there's a certain visibility to extroversion as well. And oddly enough, to introversion. Oh, that lad, I've never seen him in the pub or in a fucking outside a cinema, or I've never seen him anywhere outside of where he had to be. You know, you can kind of guess that the person's probably a little bit more introverted than extroverted. So certain personality traits and types of people, certain aspects stand out more. Physical features, obviously. If somebody's really fat, you know, it's hanging off their bones. You can fucking see it a mile off. And with extroversion, it's a bit of a trickier one. Who knows how extroverted a person is? Well, again, if you know somebody and they've never spoken a word to you in the last 5 years, but you meet them relatively regularly, odds are they're introverted. So you wear your extroversion on your sleeve. Your conscientiousness is a harder one unless you actually work with the person. But outside of working with the person, who's to know how conscientious the next person is? But I suppose that the point that I'm striving to make is we use ourselves as a barometer or a measuring stick of sorts to compare other people. But you need to know what the average is kind of like. And in order to do that, you need to know where you are on the spectrum of being. You need to know that you're a really extroverted person or a really conscientious person. You need to know that you're a really tall person. Now again, that's kind of obvious. If it's hard for you to buy clothes because you're an odd size, you know, you're going to figure out that you're either really big or really small pretty fucking fast. But the more that we can understand about ourselves and how, and importantly, how we relate to other people, because you could know every square inch of yourself, and this brings me back to the original point about AI systems and robotics. A robot will obviously know everything there is to know about itself. But it also needs to be programmed. Let's say for argument's sake, it's a humanoid thing. A humanoid robot thing will know intimately everything about itself. But if it doesn't understand itself in relation to other people, that knowledge isn't particularly useful. You can't integrate it. And we're no different. So you knowing everything there is to know about you is great. Know thyself, as the Greek maxim goes. That's fantastic. But it's not, you can't use that information in any meaningful, practical sense unless you have a good understanding of what the average is and where you are on the spectrum of being. And on that note, I'll catch you soon.